All right. Welcome back, everybody. We are here. True North Now, episode 1, the op return debate. We are here to talk about Bitcoin Core, op return, spam, Bitcoin code. And we are joined with the True North team. We've got Soleil and Adrian here to help guide this conversation that we've got with the very great Rob Hamilton. Rob, your background, you've been working in Bitcoin development for a very long time. You're co-founder and CEO of Anchorwatch, and the Bitcoin code is incredibly important to you and your company. So the goal with this episode is to provide a little bit more information and education about what this argument is. You know, we're seeing a lot of discourse on Twitter X about this topic, and you know, we're even getting asked questions personally about what we think about op return. And personally, I don't have enough information to even have an opinion on it. So that's why we're bringing you in today to give us a lay of the land, what's going on, and then talk about why this is important to Bitcoin Treasury companies and kind of go from there. So without further ado, Rob, I'm going to pass it over to you if you want to give a quick intro on yourself and Anchorwatch and what you're doing over there, and then we'll just jump right into it.
Certainly. Yeah. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Anchorwatch. The mission behind that is offering insured custody for Bitcoin. We achieve that through two pieces. One, our technology is just inherently a differentiator when it comes to keeping Bitcoin in deep cold storage. We leverage Bitcoin native smart contracts to keep the funds extra safe. We could do a whole episode on that, and that's not why we're here, but it leverages time locks and multi-sigs of multi-sigs. And the other side of the business is we are a Lloyd's of London cover holder. So we are direct agents and underwriters when it comes to Lloyd's of London policy, specifically for Bitcoin held in our cold storage solution. And that allows us to be able to offer one-to-one insurance up to $100 million per customer, and a way that's a strong, comprehensive insurance policy that really hasn't been seen in the market before. But again, I could go deep down that road, but we're not here to talk insurance and Bitcoin scripting. So
starting, I would love that.
Sure, yeah. I'm always available to hop on at another time for sure.
That'll be True North Now, episode 2.
Yeah,
perfect.
Sure.
Perfect.
And how long have you been working in Bitcoin, right? The Bitcoin developer?
Working in Bitcoin, it's funny. I actually did not work in Bitcoin until I started Anchorwatch in the basically March of 2022. But I have been a developer for longer than that, and I've been following Bitcoin development since 2013. I actually got into Bitcoin by going to the New York City BitDevs all the way back in 2013. So a little over 10, coming up on 12 years of being aware and following it, being much more hands-on and actively building on Bitcoin though over the past 3 years.
Gotcha. To me, if you go to BitDevs, that's working in Bitcoin, right? If you're working on the code, I mean, that's working in Bitcoin. You work for the computers, you work for the network. It was just a side gig.
Of course.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm hoping that you could just give us a general lay of the land of like, what's happening right now? What are people yelling about? There's a bunch of people yelling at each other. And I think it's pretty unclear, especially for people that are holding, these Bitcoin Treasury equities, that maybe have never seen Bitcoin code before. Yeah. Give us a lay of the land of what's happening here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm going to take a very high level view, there are technical elements, but I'm not going to explain them in computer science terms. I'm going to just explain it very basically. And obviously everyone has their own biases. I'll try and prevent my own kind of bleeding in, and we could talk about it in more detail. At the highest level, so a Bitcoin transaction, right? A Bitcoin transaction involves two important pieces: the input and the output. Where's the money coming from? Where's the money going to, right? Every Bitcoin transaction can be distilled down to those two core pieces. Now, there are different kinds of scripts you can use, right? People are familiar with a single signature wallet, maybe a multi-signature wallet, right? These are all different ways that you can encumber Bitcoin. Now, the thing to jump off into a point of how does Bitcoin actually work is it goes through every single block since the Genesis block back in January of 2009, and it looks and makes sure that all of the rules of what's called consensus are being followed. And it goes through this, 900,000 blocks now. And what it's doing is it's there's like one key piece of the reason why Bitcoin nodes look at everything. It's to understand what is the current UTXO set. What is a UTXO? It is an unspent transaction output. So it's whenever someone sends you money and you haven't spent it yet, that's the core ledger of where the Bitcoin live on the network, right? Now, with that said, there are also things you can do in Bitcoin, and this is what op return I'm going to talk about is a way of you can actually send, instead of sending it to a Bitcoin address, you can just use op return and add data. Now, an interesting factor of when you use op return, it is a provably unspendable output. You're sending it to just declare data. It's not going to my address or Jeff's address, right? Like it is just data. And because of that, when an op return field is in a transaction, a node will look at it and be like, okay, yeah, I see the transaction. Yeah, there's someone paid Bitcoin for this, but I don't have to hold on to that op return data anymore, right? Because it's not part of that unspent transaction output. So traditionally in Bitcoin, it was decided that this was the best way if there is going to be arbitrary data in existence. That's where you want to keep it. Now, where this controversy started happening is that by default, you're only allowed 80, 83 bytes of arbitrary data. There is a company that is building solutions on Bitcoin, and they need to post more data than that. So what they chose to do instead, because they weren't able to, the network won't, and I'll get to this in a moment, the network would not share larger op returns. They would actually encode that data using fake public keys. So basically they would put data in a Bitcoin address, but there actually wasn't a person holding keys on the other end of that. They were just using it to like park data. And this has been around Bitcoin since the beginning. People were able to basically encode memorials for people using all of this fake pub key data where you could say, I know for a fact this isn't really money. If I run a script on my computer, I can actually decode this random blob of data and have it be something else. The problem with that approach, though, is that it is those outputs, as far as the Bitcoin network is concerned, are spendable. They are not op returns. So the Bitcoin nodes have to hold on to this like garbage fake data forever if it's not in an op return. So this goes into the next piece, and then I'll stop after this. There's one core rule in how Bitcoin operates, which is called consensus. The fundamental rules of how Bitcoin runs. How much Bitcoin gets created every single block. The total supply comes from that, right? The 21 million, that's a consensus rule. You have to have Bitcoin to send Bitcoin, right? I can't send my Bitcoin to both Adrian and Jeff, and like I can't double spend, right? So these are like fundamental rules of how consensus works. There is another set of rules, which are not consensus, which are called policy. Now, these are things that the network will accept if it finds its way into a block. But by default, if you turn on your Bitcoin node and you try and do something like this, it wouldn't work. An example of this is actually op returns can go up to 1 full megabyte. They can take up the entire block. But they won't get relayed natively around the network. There's other ones too where a single transaction can't be over 400 kilobytes, right? Weight units, right? So you can't there's certain but in theory, if you went directly to a miner, you could actually get a 4 megabyte transaction in a block. So all of this, take a step back and say what Bitcoin Core did was identifying that people were routing around the policy rules to get the data they needed stored, and it'd be better if it were to be placed in an op return. I'll put a stop there because there's a lot of things I just at a very high level ran through, and there's more to talk about second and third order consequences, but I think that's a good place to start and let you guys ask some questions.
Well, yeah, that's actually where I was going to go. What are the second and third order consequences of this?
Yeah.
And I have an idea because I've been,
Sure.
following this someone. Soleil has an idea. He's been following it somewhat.
Sure.
But we want to really give you the opportunity to share the information because from my perspective as a, Bitcoiner, the risk that we need to weigh is, does this harm Bitcoin's use case as a pristine asset? Does it harm Bitcoin's use case and harm its ethos? Or are we looking at opportunity costs in terms of these things? I don't want to say muddying up the blocks and creating all kinds of unnecessary data over time. But that is a very, very real concern. So if you can kind of get into that just a little bit and help us drill down into the nuances between those two.
Happily to, yeah. So I think the first question to ask is like, Bitcoin, what is Bitcoin for? And as like pristine capital, like the best money that'll ever exist is there. What are the properties that give it that? And I would look to actually censorship resistance and permissionless network, right? And so while I personally could say I do not want people putting pictures or messages or all of these things in a Bitcoin block, if I were able to constrain a set of rules which prevented them from being able to do that, am I actually undercutting the permissionless nature of Bitcoin? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all data flying around the network.
Right.
So that would be the first thing I would point out. For second and third order consequences, it actually gets interesting where if people want to do this, if there is economic demand for people to put in non-standard transactions, whatever they are, they could be legitimate financial transactions, right? They could just be really, really big multi-sigs, right? That would actually just exceed the limits of what's available in a typical block, right? Like there are ways you can construct a financial transaction that currently would not be seen in policy. But for the most part, we try to optimize policy so that anyone with normal use of Bitcoin is going to be able to accept it. The miners are a really important stakeholder when we start thinking about second and third order consequences. Now, there is a mining pool called Mara, and they have a product called Slipstream. The whole point of this product is, hey, if you have a consensus valid transaction, send it directly to us over an API, and we'll include it in the block, and we'll take the fees for it. Mara to date has made over $2 million just accepting these non-standard transactions. Now, in the game theory of how Bitcoin ideally should be designed, every single person in the world should be able to download the Bitcoin Core software, sync up to the chain tip, plug in miners, right? And be able to find approximately the same quality of block anyone else in the network is. You should only have to compete on your engineering prowess of setting up your architecture and the source of your energy, right? That's like a fundamental thing for every miner to have equal footing. Now, this thing like Slipstream is now accreting value just to Slipstream because they get these transactions. They don't tell the rest of the network they have these transactions because it's their margin to be able to include these in blocks because no one else has seen them. And so that's an important factor to consider is our current mempool policy rules being designed in such a way that are advantageous to some miners over others. And from a permissionless, decentralized nature of the network, that's a threat to consider as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
How are the miners able to include that private data?
Because I've done this before to make a point. So an example of a policy rule is you have to send a minimum amount of Bitcoin for it to go to. I can't send one Satoshi, right? I can't send one Satoshi to an address. That's not consensus invalid, though. That's just the policy rules of how the network runs. So someone once dared me saying, okay, filters don't work. Send 100 sats to my address right here. So what did I do? I pulled up my Bitcoin node. I made a transaction sending him 100 sats, and I had a transaction hex, which is basically, you could almost feel like how a Bitcoin transaction work is like you have like this signed check. And I could just hold on to the check. And the way normally Bitcoin transactions work is my node says, hey, I have a signed check. I tell all of my peers. So each node connects to like 8 to 12 different peers on the network. And then those basically become like this massive flood network across the entire network. And this is part of the permissionless nature of Bitcoin is that if I have a transaction and I broadcast it to a node, the whole network will see it, right? The whole network is going to be able to see it at the same time. The problem is that my node software would not let me send this kind of transaction, which was entirely valid to the rest of the network. So what did I do? I went to Twitter and I found Chun, who runs F2 Pool. He was actually one of the guys who went up on the SpaceX polar exploration a couple of months ago. I sent him the transaction hex and he said, cool, as long as you pay 10x the fee, I'll include it in the next block. And sure enough, I got found in a block shortly after. The reason why, and that's another part too, is that because it's privileged access, you can't just, if everyone in the network could see it, you would have a supply demand equilibrium and I'd be paying the same market rate as everyone else. But since I wanted to do this and none of the other mining pools had it, the only way it would ever get found in a block is if he mined it. He's able to charge a premium, right?
Okay.
Right. And so the signed check is legitimate. And normally what you do is you announce to the whole network, hey, I have a signed check, this transaction, please include it in your mempool. And everyone's like, all the miners get to see it. Because all the people I connect to probably aren't miners, but maybe the people they're connected to are miners, right? And then it gets in the miners mempool where they're creating the block templates to get it included. So because I wasn't able to openly broadcast it to the network, I did what's called an out-of-band transaction. Meaning instead of it going through this public network everyone can see, I just sent the check directly to him in a Twitter DM because it's just zeros and ones in data. And he took it and then he put it inside of his block explore his mempool at the mining pool and was able to get it included. So that's how they're able to keep it private. And then once I give that to him, he is not incentivized to let every other mining pool know about it. Because if another mining pool found it, he wouldn't get the fees.
Oh, right.
Whoever found the block would get the fees. And this is just one last note. The way a Bitcoin transaction works is you have your inputs and your outputs. I'll make the math very simple and say, I have 10 Bitcoin. I want to send 1 Bitcoin to Jeff. So I have 10 Bitcoin on the input, 9 Bitcoin on the output. There's no fee. So what I'd actually do, let's just say I'll send 10 Bitcoin in and I'll send 1 to Jeff and I'll give myself 8 back as change. So I have 10 on the input side and I have 9 on the output side. I paid Jeff as 1. I overpaid for sure. But then that 1 Bitcoin that is less the input of the output is the miner fee.
Is the fee.
So that's how the miner fees work, right? So if another person found that block, they would not have gotten the fees. Someone else would have gotten the fees.
That's why when we watched the halving event, like the first block of the halving, the fees were just astronomical because people are shoving data in there and trying to get a certain miner that wants to, mine that block.
That's right. Yeah. There was we don't have to talk details, but there was a launch of a protocol that took place at the halving. And so the first block this protocol went live was at the halving block. And so everyone was putting a bunch of, on the surface, irrational economic data, right? So they're paying multiple Bitcoin in fees to send $5 worth of Bitcoin. And on its face, like this is economically irrational. The reason why is there is a non-Bitcoin protocol that is ascribing value to that transaction. And they are speculating that they could make more money, basically gambling, right? It's a gamble. So that's at the highest level, like how that all works mechanically.
Rob, thanks so much for doing this because the whole debate has got me excited to start running a node. Okay. So I'm hoping to, get some guidance on how do I decide, what to run and all that good stuff. But I want to go back to the thing that you said about it being included in op return allows it to be pruned basically and discarded, but that's not for archival nodes, right? So if you want to run a full node, you have to include everything, right?
Yeah, if you are so there's 2 pieces here, right? So there is the UTXO set, right? That list of all of the money and then every single block, right? So if you want to hold on to every single block forever, absolutely, you need to hold all the data. You can't omit any of that, but it doesn't get part of that UTXO set. And arguably, I think everyone would agree in the debate, the most scarce resource, the one that we have to be most sensitive to is not the size of the blockchain, because memory at its base is just fundamentally, easier to from a data perspective, like hard drives are accessible and they're becoming cheaper and cheaper. It's actually the size of that UTXO set is the most scarce resource because that has to be stored in reality in memory. And you have to make sure that you always have access to it, right? And you're constantly, basically when a new block comes in, your node says, okay, I see a bunch of transactions. Are they in my current UTXO set? And it'll do the checks, right? Your own node will run all of those checks to make sure that no one's cheating. And for you personally running a node, I recommend anyone who personally holds keys to Bitcoin should run a node because if you're holding the keys yourself, you want to make sure it's the way that you can independently verify you have received Bitcoin without trusting someone else. Right. If I send you Bitcoin and just the River dashboard says, oh, Bitcoin received, you're trusting River on that. Whereas if I send it to your node, you can actually look at the block as it comes in and your own software will be like, yep, I have received the Bitcoin. Right. So there's that. There's also just privacy considerations. If you're using someone else's node to broadcast your transaction, they now know that this computer connection is holding Bitcoin here, right? And also too, just like verifying the own integrity of everything. So I recommend after a certain point, you don't have to be clear. But I would just recommend though, running a node is good. I would even just take, before we continue, like 30,000 foot back. I think Bitcoin's going to be fine. I think Bitcoin as anti-fragile money can withstand people putting graffiti on chain. And if for some reason it could not, then Bitcoin wasn't destined to succeed anyway. Like if this is the thing that takes down Bitcoin, we all massively overestimated how resilient the network was, right? Because like for the length of time the internet has existed, people have been trolls on the internet. So why wouldn't they be with an internet native currency, right? So like that's how I view it, is that it could seem really heated and charged, but like this has not changed my outlook on Bitcoin. I'm not selling my Bitcoin over this change. I know some people have publicly declared they would sell their Bitcoin over this. Yeah, I mean, we could keep it high level and educational without talking about individual people, but there are people who've said like I would sell. It's not atypical. There is actually a very famous I'm pulling up the exact the resolution of the Bitcoin experiment by Mike Hearn. Mike Hearn was one of the leading Bitcoin developers. This is right before the block size war. And on January 14th, 2016, he had a long blog post about how this is the end of the Bitcoin experiment. And the Bitcoin price that day was $380.
Yeah.
So like it is not uncommon for prominent developers to feel like the mission has gone astray and they publicly exit saying that I am washing my hands of this Bitcoin thing. And then Bitcoin does let's do some rough math here, a 300x since then.
Yeah.
Right. So like one of the few things I would caution, if anyone's appealing to fear and that like this is like the stake of the network and like will it survive, to take a deep breath. I would not put it anywhere near that bucket, and don't do anything too rash because of that.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard some people try to compare it to another block size war, and I've thought that's a little bit hyperbolic. So hearing you say that is it reassures that my logic was sound with it. And sorry, Nico, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to throw
no, not at all.
It's not another block size war, right? This is
not.
The network's going to have to grow. It's going to have to adapt. The network is as much organic as it is code, in my view. And I think that things like this we're all going to be part of the course in Bitcoin's growth and development.
Yeah, I would add to say that this is not a block size war, period, or yet, right? And the reason I say yet is that there may be disgruntled people who don't like how things are being handled. And you actually can't have a block size war, like a fork war, unless you're trying to change consensus. And this entire conversation had nothing to do with consensus. Now, if they come back and say, this is all over and captured, we need to make consensus changes that are actually going to split the network, that is a block size war in that sense. But no one has openly yet threatened or commented that. I think that's all kind of premature. And I think that they're not intentionally pushing that narrative because they know that they're not going to win that if it comes to a consensus fight.
That would be an extreme escalation.
That would be it's the final escalation, right? It's the final thing you can do.
And then we'll find out what the network feels about it, right? Kind of.
And every single Bitcoin treasury company and every single person who holds Bitcoin, the way Bitcoin works at a fork is let's just make the math easy. Let's say we just had block 900,000 2 days ago, right? At block 900,001, let's say there's a fork. If you have Bitcoin from block 900,000 or prior, you actually get coins on each chain, right? Because you have a shared path and you go like this and you split off. You hold coins on both sides of the chain. So your Bitcoin exposure, if you're super risk adverse, is just don't do anything. And no matter how it all shakes out, you will have the same amount of Bitcoin. You would, if you had one Bitcoin and then a fork happens, you have one Bitcoin on fork A and one Bitcoin on fork B, and you don't do anything 10 years from now, you'll have one Bitcoin, whatever one's the winning network, right? So that's one thing. If you're more aggressive, you can make a decision and say, I personally sold my Bitcoin cash. I sold my Bitcoin cash somewhere in like a 0.15 ratio. So I got like a Bitcoin dividend. I actually, for every Bitcoin I had, I got 0.15 Bitcoin because I sold
Same.
the BCH coins for BTC and moved it back. Right. So
Exactly.
I don't think a fork's happening though.
I would be very shocked if that.
I would be very
happened.
shocked as well.
Especially with the institutions, especially with like strategy and the miners and all that. I would be very shocked if it got to that level. I think they would step in before that point.
Yeah. I agree. I think that not only would they step in, it would become very clearly apparent that there's not support to do a fork, and they could de-escalate at that point.
Yeah. Rob, you mentioned biases earlier, and I think it's
Sure.
I think you can kind of tell what side people are on the debate because they'll either call it spam or they'll call it a digital artifact. You know what I mean? Like even the language you use kind of just identifies people right from the beginning. But is there a way to objectively determine what is spam or not spam, or what do you think?
I would say no. On several fronts. One, if someone is willing to pay Bitcoin as a permissionless network, if someone's willing to pay for a consensus valid transaction, like it's being stored, right? That's the whole point of the game. Now, if you're going to say like our inscriptions, right, like putting these like pictures on chain spam, when you get into like those levels of debates, the question is, and I think Andrew Polster, it was Peter Willa and Andrew Polster, right when all this stuff started, we're like, yes, this is not something we want on the network, but there isn't a way to reduce it that doesn't introduce more harm than less, right? And I think when you're going through the conversation like of an is ought problem, like this is happening, what ought we do about it? That's where a lot of this stuff, like it is spam. It's like, okay, so it is spam. How would you like to resolve it? Right. And I think a lot of the conversation on filters and mempool policy are not effective because people can route around it. So if it isn't clear at this point, I am more on the side of this being something that is not going away, and that Bitcoin Core did the right thing by loosening the op return restriction. And ultimately, I understand why people are upset and they're trying to do something about it. But at a higher level of analysis, that Bitcoin's permissionless network has to be able to do these things for it to be permissionless. And anything that we would instill into the network to restrict that behavior is going to be concerning on several fronts. One, there's now shown a way that you can actually socially pressure developers to make Bitcoin less permissionless. That could be used for malice down the road. You're going to actively just enrich other miners to enable to do things that other miners aren't going to see by default. And you're actually the inevitable game theory is the whole peer-to-peer relaying of transactions starts to go away. And what you do is you just go to the top 10 block producers and you just send them transactions directly. Right. The further you grip your tight in trying to control this, the worse the problem becomes.
Yeah. So I see, if I try to look at both sides, I think one side is saying the free market will decide, right? If the fees get too expensive, it will disincentivize doing it. And then I think the other side is the people who think that the nodes should have complete autonomy and self-sovereignty to decide what they want to relay or not relay. Can you balance those two arguments?
Well, I fundamentally believe, so I just realized I did not tweet out your guys' space, so I was going to go tweet that out.
Tweet.
Yeah, of course. So I'm pulling it up right here. Anyway, sorry. So I think fundamentally, just from like a sense of like property rights, every single person should be able to run whatever software they want, right? Like that's actually several parts of the governance of how Bitcoin works as a network. Bitcoin does not have auto updates. Does not. Explicitly to prevent people from being forced to choose a new set of software they did not explicitly agree to, right? I believe people should be able to run their own free open source software however they choose. Like that is an obvious personal freedom right on how you exercise that. What was the second part of your question?
Just comparing the one side of the argument that's talking about nodes should have self-sovereignty versus the free market solution of, fees will get expensive and people will be disincentivized to do it.
Well, I don't view those 2 points in contradiction to each other, right? Every single individual person can run whatever software they want, period, right? Like I'm in the United States, live in a free country. Bitcoin's a free, openless, permissionless network. Do whatever you want on your own computer with your own bandwidth and your own disk space. That's all your business, right? The free market, though, like Bitcoin naturally has to exist in a game theoretic puzzle where everyone has to assume to be greedy actors. Because the moment you have some non-greed based factor, you have like a meta protocol rule of how things should be run, and they are not enforced by the consensus rules, the Bitcoin starts to break, right? Like asking miners to altruistically make less money than what's available, right? People would actually look back on the block size wars and say a lot of the miners were actively hostile to turning on Segwit, which enabled the Lightning Network and part of the block size war, and they put it up. Jihan, like the guys over on the mining side, basically put up that like they didn't want to have Segwit activated. It turns out they had special software called ASIC Boost that allowed them to mine pre-Segwit blocks faster than anyone else on the market. Right, that was like a hidden thing that we didn't find out until after the fact of why they were so eager. They were getting like an extra juice out of their mining software that no one else knew about, and Segwit broke that. Ultimately, if you get a pool of the economic actors, the economic nodes in Bitcoin, to agree to something, you can tell miners they have to cut it out, right? So in the sense that like, the nodes work for the miners, abstractly is true, but it's the aggregate economic weight. And I think for your audience thinking about this too, the strategy, the Bitcoin Treasury companies of the world, they themselves are like one step removed from these economic nodes, right? Strategy is not self-custodying their Bitcoin running a node. They have custodians that they work with. But those custodians that are holding the ETF coins, that are holding, the Bitcoin Treasury company coins, their say and weight in how they want to govern how their software runs has a disproportionate amount of influence than if I just went to Best Buy down the street and I went and installed Bitcoin Core and I put $100 on it, right? Like we're both nodes on the network, but the node that's managing all of those ETF coins and all of the treasury company coins they are larger, what's called economic nodes. And when there's actually a fork and a disagreement in the network, those economic nodes are the ones that throw their weight around quite literally and kind of impacting how Bitcoin continues to evolve at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So can you just explain on a basic level, you can run the Bitcoin code with different softwares?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Like how does that work?
So there is a set of rules that Bitcoin runs by, which is called consensus, right? How transactions are validated, how blocks are validated, are like the two big things. An individual transaction, like, hey, I want to spend some money. And then like, here is a mined block of all of the transactions that this miner found. Those two key pieces are like the heart and soul of like the network. In theory, not that I in theory could sit in my basement and I could code up a whole way of in parallel mimicking all of Bitcoin's consensus rules, but I do a bunch of my own things on the side, right? And that would be an alternate implementation of a Bitcoin client. So there's a couple, like we'll put me as an example aside for a second. The major implementations that exist out there are Bitcoin Core, the canonical like reference implementation that goes all the way back to Satoshi. You have Bitcoin Knots, which is a fork of Bitcoin Core with Luke Dasher maintaining that with a bunch of extra rules and flavors and changes, right? And then you also have BTCD. BTCD is written in Go instead of C++, and it's used a lot with a lot of Lightning Network like architecture, right? Then there's also libBitcoin by Eric Voskuil, which is another implementation of how this all works, right? And so you can run other clients. It's just very important you don't do something that causes a fork in the network or something to be in disagreement. And that's usually with consensus rules. A little history example, there's a Bitcoin developer named Barak. He made a 900 of 98 out of 999 multi-sig for fun, broadcast it out to the network. The BTCD node implementation had a bug in its consensus code and said that was invalid, so it rejected the block. So there was a time period where the BTCD nodes went down and the Bitcoin Core nodes and the Knots nodes all ran fine, right? So this is kind of like the thing you need to start being aware of. If you're doing an alternate implementation, the most important piece is it matching the existing consensus of the network? Because if there's a disagreement, no one's running a BTCD node at an exchange, right? We at Anchorwatch run Bitcoin Core. I saw Alex Leishman at River said they run Bitcoin Core. I think a lot of, to my knowledge, most, if not most businesses, I know 2 examples. Ocean runs Knots. Start9 Labs runs Knots. Everyone else that I've talked to, I could be wrong, is running Bitcoin Core, right? So when you're talking about other implementations, and when you're talking about rough consensus, you want to make sure that you're always swimming along with the school of fish. Because if you, for some reason, break off, something could break, right? That's not to say that writing an alternate implementation is explicitly malicious, right? Like that just happens. Like people want to write in a different language. They want to do something, but the rules of the road are what Bitcoin Core says, because that's where all the economic weight and activity is today.
Is there a benefit to having multiple variations, like as another form of decentralization, or is that not a big deal?
There's 2 schools of thought on this, right? There's one school of thought on this, which is that it's good to have many eyes reviewing one process, and that everyone should be able to coalesce and agree on one set of code. Bitcoin is such a unique software project that one, it's primarily written in C++, so you have to be an experienced C++ developer. 2, Bitcoin specifically, with all of its nuances and quirks, is such a unique code base that you have to actually spend years to skill up to get to a point where you're actually meaningfully able to contribute in big ways to the project. It's not something that you can pull a C++ developer off the street somewhere, throw them into Bitcoin, and they're going to be able to do it, right? And it's not saying that like they're bad developers. It's just that Bitcoin as a software project is so unique to anything else that exists that like you can't view it like any other software project. So in that sense, the one side of the argument is we want as many eyes as possible doing the shared review, and having the most experienced people all focusing on the same thing. The alternative, though, is that competing implementations brings about health in the network by having different perspectives and different priorities, where everyone doesn't have to row in the same one bunch of oarmen just all rowing in the same direction. That you can kind of just go do your own thing over here. I'm not opposed to alternate implementations. I think the minimum criteria, though, to have a sustainable alternate implementation is like 3 to 5 full-time developers that are just working on that, right? Yeah. And the best way, if you were attempting to do something different, is at least start with Bitcoin Core and fork off that, because at least you can like pair with all of that work, and then maybe there's extra things you want to work on the side, right? I haven't seen anyone come to that point though yet.
So would you call this a software fork?
Forks, I mean, it's literally like a GitHub. Like, so on GitHub where you manage code, you can click the fork button and you basically get a copy of the code, but you're the owner as opposed to whoever the organization is. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, got it.
And Bitcoin land, we talk forks about like literally splitting the economic activity of the blockchain and forking. I'm not saying we're there at the moment, but there's a risk of when you hit that fork button that you can cause a software fork depending on what you do.
Got it.
We were talking about second and third order effects, and I think some people have described the Segwit and Taproot, or the ability to even do the ordinals. It could even be a bug from those implementations, and then we need to figure out a way to fix the glitch. I guess would be a way of saying it. Does that sound off base, or? I guess I consider myself kind of in the ossify camp. So
sure.
I want to fix bugs for sure. Like I don't want Bitcoin's security to be threatened. So I want all the bugs fixed. So would this qualify in that sense? Or is this just, unintended consequences, but not like the end of the world?
Well, I would definitely put it as unintended consequences, not the end of the world. Like Bitcoin has not lost its value proposition because of this. Not to mention right now, the blocks are empty. Like I'm gonna go look like right now. Yeah, like literally, okay, it's really heated up today. There are 1, 2, 3, 4.5 blocks of pending transactions. Right. You can get into the next block for 2 sats of VByte, which is the second lowest price besides 1 sat per VByte, right? Which within standard rules. Is the question though, like, is it incumbent on developers to fix this bug? Right. Like, and I guess that goes back to like what you have to fix it fundamentally at consensus. And the question is, how do you fix it at consensus without destroying Bitcoin as permissionless money?
Yep.
Not to mention the people who want to put these JPEGs in there, they have much faster software development cycles than Bitcoin Core. So Bitcoin Core twice a year, every 6 months, says, here are all the changes we've made, make an update, right? Like if you want to update, if you so choose to update, every 6 months, they just kind of like drop an arbitrary date, because it's not like other software, there's major release, brand new feature online, right? Like they don't want to constrain the devs to like rush to get a timeline out. So they just pick once every 6 months, whatever the latest updates have been made gets tagged as a major version release. So if they were going to actually do a fix that like at the consensus level, remove this, what's going to happen the day after is all of the people that want to speculate and do this stuff are going to ever so slightly tweak the logic, and then they're just going to do it again, right? So it becomes a perpetual cat and mouse game where the people that want to send Bitcoin was designed to be able to permissionally send Bitcoin transactions. Like that's just part of the core ethos of not only the development philosophy, but the actual code itself makes it, all of the threat modeling and designing is like, if I have a Bitcoin transaction, how do I prevent from being censored, right? And so when that's like so integral to the DNA of how Bitcoin works, it's a very rough proposition to get in there. On the ossifying side, I would encourage for yourself or the audience at home of just understanding that Bitcoin as a software project is programmable money, that there are ways that we can update it in the future in such a way that can actually add to that end value case. And so being reserved and not merge every random idea that shows up getting added to the code, I would agree. But understanding that as Bitcoin evolves, that there are ways that we can incrementally improve it that make it better money.
Who runs Bitcoin? Like who controls Bitcoin Core?
So on a governance level, there is like in the GitHub repo, there are 5 people which are called maintainers. These maintainers are the ones that have the ability to close like discussions, or more importantly, merge code. So like after all the review process is done, there's 5 people that can click the button and add that to the Bitcoin Core code base, right? So from as much of a governance level that exists in Bitcoin Core, you could view them as the people who literally choose if code gets added or not, right? So as for who runs it, though, there's always a question of if those developers were captured or malicious or for whatever reason not doing their jobs,
right?
The rest of the developers could just go fork it and just change out the maintainers and have a new crew of people sitting in there, right?
Right.
So there's like a soft power balance at play of like, it's not that these 5 people literally can do whatever they want. They often are looking towards the rest of the community to understand kind of like guiding principles for the project.
Got it. So this is like Coca-Cola. Like all these people can't be on the same plane at the same time. You know?
A little bit, right? I mean, tragically, if something bad like that were to happen, at least software is a lot easier to reorg than like company governance. You know what I mean? Like it's just software. It's open software, so you can just clone it and fork it and move on. But yeah, they all focus on different parts of the protocol too, right? Because Bitcoin is such a vast protocol. They all focus on different elements of how it all runs.
Got it.
So I was an anarchist before I found Bitcoin, so it really just appealed to me as freedom money. And this debate is really breaking my brain on this front.
Yeah.
So I love the peer-to-peer. I love permissionless.
Yep.
And so I'm on this weird, I'm on the fence because I feel like the nodes are the only ones that can correctly identify their own self-interests.
Sure.
So I want the nodes to have as much power to decide what they want to relay and what they don't.
Sure.
But then on the other side, every time you try to ban something, it just goes black market and makes it more expensive. And I think that's the cat and mouse game that you were kind of referencing.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that a little bit? Is there a little bit of a philosophical resolution that we need to resolve between those two?
I think encouraging every individual to run whatever software they want, first and foremost. Bitcoin actually is anarchy. Like as the governance system for Bitcoin is anarchy. It's not a democracy, right? You don't get 51% of the nodes to pass a board resolution to go do something, right? You actually can't even use the number of nodes for meaningful governance conversations, because I can sit on AWS right now and spin up 10,000 nodes.
Yeah.
Right. So you like one node, one vote is not really a thing. Satoshi originally alluded to that with like mining, but that was back in 2008 when people weren't really using it. People weren't botnetting Bitcoin in 2009, right? Like it just wasn't a thing. So the way I would view it is the sense of anarchy, because you at any point can do whatever the heck you want. Tomorrow, you could fork Bitcoin and you could double the supply and do whatever, and no one can stop you because it's all software, right?
Right.
The messy part is with consensus and Bitcoin having value as a network, you need to make sure you're aligned with other stakeholders. So in that sense, it's not just the nodes, but it's the like from an individual, each person should be able to run whatever software they run. As far as the network goes, that is economic nodes, right? And that someone who's holding 1 million Bitcoin across Treasury companies and exchange customers explicitly has more influence over the governance of the protocol in the event there's a fork, right?
Nice.
So you have to look at it through that lens as well. I understand a lot of people come into Bitcoin through like the anarchy, freedom, money side of things, and then you get into this like, well, and the one word of warning and caution I would put out there is that whatever you think Bitcoin is, it's not entirely that. And that your relationship with how you identify with Bitcoin has to be flexible to update and evolve over time as you increase your understanding, and also understanding that other participants in the network may not share that vision with you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so everyone should be able to run whatever software they want. 100% agreed. And when it comes to this cat and mouse game, understanding those second and third order consequences for the health of the network in aggregate, are your behaviors harmful or helpful, right? And I think that's where Bitcoin Core came down on for the op return issue specifically, was that on net, it's more harmful than helpful to have these restrictions in place. So we should loosen those. Yeah. And so that's just caution. Like, again, just for your whole audience, like Bitcoin's fine. It's not dying over this. It's going to be okay. The entire value proposition of Bitcoin as digital gold and as a treasury asset for companies has not been touched or impeded at all. It's all going to be okay.
Yeah, this is. Oh,
go ahead, Adrian.
Go ahead, Adrian.
And this is one of the things that I've tried to bring into consideration in the conversation around Bitcoin and like the Bitcoin treasury companies, is that the companies, the miners, us, we're all peers in this network, right? Peers of different scale, but we're all peers.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And it stands to reason that peers would have interests that run contrary to what another group of peers would want, right? That's kind of inevitable. So
absolutely.
I'm kind of along the lines with Soleil here, in that I'm somewhat torn. I'm not an ossify person, but I also don't want us to see a potential future where Bitcoin is spammed into oblivion and the blocks are so, and the network is just grinds to a halt. But the thing is, these additional data files, I don't know if they would pose that level of a threat over time, unless we're talking about like a time frame of what, decades, centuries?
Yeah, it has to be
theory,
in theory,
so,
right?
And that, so I'm trying to keep somewhat of a nuanced view to remember that everyone in the network that's holding the asset, everyone in the network that is a participant on the node, so on and so forth, we're all peers of different size and scale and interests. So I think that as the network grows, this is going to have to be a balance that's kind of maintained. And these kinds of debates are par for the course. But having the debate be, as corny as it sounds, open source and open forum, I think is the best way to drive them to conclusion versus people screaming at each other online.
1,000% agreed on all of that. And I would say that when you are a peer in the Bitcoin network, whether you're a miner, whether you're an individual running it, or a business that has Bitcoin on their balance sheet, there is one thing. It's a big bucket. One thing everyone agrees to is consensus. It's actually the limiting principle is like, I may not like you, but you're going to be able to send Bitcoin because it's all following within the game theory and the incentives and the consensus of Bitcoin, right? That's the phrase, Bitcoin is for enemies, right? That like people you don't like can use Bitcoin, but that also protects your right to be able to use Bitcoin, right? As a money makes it kind of like that, one of those really valuable traits to it. I agree with debates open in public. I find that higher bandwidth forms of communication, whether it's audio and or video, are way better for kind of discerning and kind of teasing out these mechanics and pieces. there's something just, I think, about human psychology with text and a screen and words, and you don't see the other person having a conversation, that just cause things to deteriorate.
Be misinterpreted.
Yeah, be misinterpreted, right? Tone doesn't get conveyed at all. Those are all things that are important for the discussion overall, right? And the way I'd agree with keeping the conversation open. The one asterisk I would put on that specifically is like Bitcoin has a mailing list where people talk about higher level, like abstract philosophy. And the GitHub repo is specifically for reviewing the code as it's written, right? Like the technical soundness of the code for the proposed change. And that for effectiveness, those more esoteric, like bigger questions are for the mailing list. If you're going to take it to the developers to have a conversation rather than the individual GitHub repos. And then obviously Twitter too. You can go talk about it all day on Twitter. If you're trying to look for the larger audience though, like a lot of prolific developers aren't on Twitter. So if you're trying to like on this technical level wrestle with this stuff, maybe the mailing list. The mailing list is Satoshi started the mailing list. It's kind of the canonical place where developers go for those higher level conversations. But you may not be getting the expected. You may be thinking, I'll just go to GitHub and talk about it on GitHub. Realistically, like that's just like the longer pulled out discussions aren't really for the GitHub. That's basically the equivalent of the office space for the developers, right? And someone's just randomly walking into their office space and like yelling at them saying that they're killing Bitcoin. Not productive.
So really everything that's happening on X is just noise.
I think it's interesting. X is actually an interesting place where narratives kind of coalesce and people like have discussions. I've been talking about this filter opportune stuff. Opportune less so until more recently, but like the filter and inscription stuff for over 2 years at this point, or coming up on 2 years.
I saw you on Galaxy Brains. It was 2 years ago.
Yeah, right. It's like I would say on balance, everyone's biased. My perspective of the debate saying that you can't do anything about this and it's not effective and it's just going to continue has been what you have seen come to pass. There hasn't been some great banding together to make this stop across the network. The only reason why it stopped is because people have stopped doing it. There's an economic demand anymore. So yeah, and I want to, I mean, I can go for longer. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There were other questions. Maybe you want to talk about just like for a Bitcoin Treasury company, like what they're, should they really care? Like,
should they care?
Yeah.
Personally,
should a Bitcoin Treasury company care? Yeah.
That was one of my notes. I've been looking at my notes, trying to scroll through the questions I was going to ask.
Yeah.
That was actually one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And so for that, I would be of the mind that this particular issue isn't one of the scale that they should be reevaluating their investment thesis on Bitcoin over at all. And understanding that Bitcoin is an anti-fragile, resilient system, that if this is the kind of thing that has you concerned about Bitcoin's future, just understand that like, these are just people that are gambling on the internet. And like, this isn't even like a serious threat and attack in that sense. And so I wouldn't put it in that bucket. Like another one, like should Bitcoin Treasury companies run nodes? If they are holding keys, absolutely. Right. And this is just an important thing to think, like, do I want to run a node? You want to be able to run a node if you're holding keys and processing your transactions. If you're not holding keys, you still can run a node. Maybe you know specifically, hey, my Bitcoin is sitting at the custodian at address X. You could run a node so you could just look at it, right? And just know that my money is exactly where it says it is. I'm not trusting a custodian's UI to say, hey, your Bitcoin's right here and here's your balance, right? But unless you're a Bitcoin Treasury company or like a lot of Bitcoin, you're not going to know exactly where your Bitcoin lives on chain if it's in an omnibus account, right? Like Coinbase has an omnibus wallet with a bunch of Bitcoin in it. Your Bitcoin specifically is not earmarked. So I would just have that caveat. I would encourage, when legally and compliantly possible, Bitcoin Treasury companies, I think, should be holding their own keys and running their own nodes for sure. I think it's good for the health of the network. It puts them in direct control of their assets. I understand that there's legal and technical and liability and risk hurdles that prevent a lot from doing that today, but that would be my general true north advice. Just like as a general direction to start marching towards, that would be good.
Well, what is that? So 30 seconds, what does that even look like? So let's say you have Strategy, you have Similar, you have all these different treasury companies. They want to effectively say, we're going to go take that next step. We're going to start having running nodes. We're going to start maybe even having core devs working for the team, maybe on some level.
Maybe.
What does that even look like? Like let's take the regulatory hurdles out of it. What is the practical way that they can even do that?
Yeah. So the way I would think about that to start is maybe they are invested in the maintenance and the health and security of Bitcoin. So maybe they want to donate a head count to work on this stuff. I think that's totally, if you're sitting on a bunch of Bitcoin, you're investing in a long-term stake of the network, sponsoring a developer may make sense, right? You're going to want to maybe hold keys, right? So you're going to want to have some sort of it's a whole risk management exercise, truly. There are companies that hold their Bitcoin with Anchorwatch, right? My company, where they hold keys and we hold keys, and the money can't move unless we both agree to sign and move the keys, and the Bitcoin is insured. Like, that's a path for moving forward. Running your own node, that becomes largely like if you have an existing IT team, you'd be able to do that. In theory, you could run the node on your own computer, right? Right. Like, I have a Bitcoin node sitting on my computer right now. I turn it on and I go check some things out every once in a while. It's the software is designed to be easy to run, right? There's documentation out there for what it looks like to run a node. You could also run like node in a boxes, you can buy like products that are just kind of like bundling. Here's the hardware and the software, and then you just plug it in and it runs. I think if companies are looking to kind of like dig deeper into that, you do want to have either advisors or people on staff who are technically knowledgeable in how this all works. That's for your own risk management, your own understanding of it, having people that are aligned to you as an employee to be able to speak to these things. And that's kind of like it's an open journey on how you want to proceed for all these treasury companies. If you remove all the regulatory hurdles, I think some portion of their own treasury should be held themselves directly. And there's ways that you can secure it in a way and insure it, right? Talk about my company. Like, there's ways that you can kind of protect yourself. And I would just kind of put that as a general thing. Just like, you don't want to just jump in all the way immediately. You should take your own learning journey, and your execution should not outpace your understanding, would be my general advice. You don't want to go too far too fast and not understand what's happening. Bitcoin's fine at the moment. Take your time. Start your journey on that path if you want to go down that path, and have it be something that you work towards when you feel comfortable and you've aligned all of your stakeholders in pursuing that journey as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. This has been phenomenally helpful for me. Totally. I think my final thought is goes back to what you were saying is, run the node and then run whichever code you like, because even though I don't really vote in politics anymore, I think this is really one of the only things that I think the voting actually counts. So I'm excited to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great.
Yeah. And I think if I were to summarize this debate really comes down to, the ability to put data on chain on any individual transaction, and it's going to happen regardless, and it may happen in different ways. And so this opening up of the op return filter allows it to just happen organically.
It allows it in the least harmful way. Yeah. If you're going to put arbitrary data into Bitcoin somewhere, the least harmful way is via an op return.
Yeah. And that may bloat the size of the data of the entire Bitcoin blockchain. And so
a small technical thing is that op return predates Segwit from 2017. So it doesn't use the witness discount, which is kind of talked about sometimes, where the inscriptions use the witness discount and they're getting data for cheap. Op return, since it's pre-Segwit, if you had blocks that were just full of op returns, like the biggest block size you would get is 1 megabyte, because it would be all legacy pre-Segwit data. Whereas if you use inscriptions and you use Segwit and leaving it in the witness, the Segwit is short for segregated witness, where we separate out the witness data for a transaction. That actually gets you could view it as 1/4 of the size, or 4x, like depending on how you look at it. But 1 byte, it takes 4 bytes in the witness to equal 1 byte outside, like within the core transaction data, right? So it actually would make smaller blocks if everything was op return.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All of the details and arcane mechanics of Bitcoin. Yeah. It's its own rabbit hole in its own right.
Got it. Yeah. Well, this has been incredibly helpful. Great conversation. We appreciate your perspective. Also, running a business, the code is incredibly important to you, right? Like knowing you need to know you're watching all of this stuff happen in real time. Yeah. So I really appreciate you taking the time and giving us your perspective. I'm sure we'll have other questions and have you back on at some point in the future. So, Adrian, you want to provide final thoughts, and maybe Rob will pass it over to you to close it out with final thoughts.
Yeah. So my final thoughts on this are just to echo what everyone else has said. It was great having you on. It was great having this perspective. These are definitely considerations that I think are going to be an ongoing topic. If it's not going to be opera terms, it's going to be something else in 5, 10 years, right? So having open discourse, I think, is huge. And you coming on and being so open with it was very, very helpful. And I urge anyone watching this that before they form any hardline views, do what we've done here. Do a little bit of research, have a little bit of conversation, and try to educate yourself on it as much as possible, because we all believe in Bitcoin, right? Everyone here, everyone watching, all of the companies, they all believe in Bitcoin. So it is in our own collective interest to make sure that we move forward as in as least a painful way as possible. I guess that's the clumsiest way I can say it. We want to move forward in a way that helps Bitcoin adopt and grow.
Yeah. And I would encourage to echo that sentiment. If you care about Bitcoin, to have an understanding of how this stuff works. And realistically, it's so spread out and complicated just as a software project that no one is a single, like we left, it's been 12 years probably since there was one person like Satoshi who understood how all of Bitcoin worked. And it's only grown so much then, like on the technical side and the second, third order effects and all these things. So I would just encourage having a robust network of people that you listen to and think for yourself and come up with your own opinion, and just constantly have that Socratic discussion with yourself and understanding, checking your own premises, your own biases, right? And just part of your own journey with Bitcoin. Just always scrutinizing where information is coming from, including me, maybe especially me, and coming up with your own judgment and discernments for yourself, and just kind of have that network of people you can talk to understand things at a deeper level.
Appreciate it. You're a national treasure, Rob. Thank you. Thank you to the 3,000 people that have
Thanks,
watched this. True North Now, episode 1 is concluded. Thank you.